Hey, and thanks for watching. In this video, I'll be talking through the Waterfall module in my value add. Now, this is a long overdue tutorial meant to have done this about a year ago and just haven't gotten around to it. So I had a few minutes this weekend. I figured I'd put this together. So I am using version 0.85 of my value add apartment acquisition model. If you're familiar with this model, all of the inputs are housed here on the underwriting tab. Along the top, we have this navigation bar. And out here to the far right, we have the Waterfall tab. Now, when we say Waterfall, we're speaking of partnership level cash flows, right? So the property produces cash flows or has cash flow needs. And those cash flow needs or that cash flow that's available to distribute flows into the partnership or to the partners. And then that cash flow is split between the partners based on some waterfall structure. Now, this particular model uses a European style waterfall, which is a common waterfall. And when we say European style, what that means, not that this is a waterfall specific to Europe. This is a structure that's common throughout the United States, all the Western Hemisphere, as well as the Eastern Hemisphere. But really what it means is that the GP does not earn a promote until the LP has received a full return of capital. Or said another way, operating cash flows are treated the same as capital event cash flows, such that once the LP hits its preferred return, and this preferred return is an IRR, a preferred return, once it hits that preferred return, then a promote can be paid to the GP. Also, this waterfall has 4 tiers. And so there's the preferred return tier. And again, in that tier, you'll see return of capital followed by the preferred return. And then 3 additional tiers, which are promote tiers. Again, each one of these tiers being driven by some IRR hurdle. Now, the module also includes the option to include GP fees, as well as to set the amount of contributions distributed or contributed, I should say, by the GP and the LP. The other thing to point out is that all cash flow in this waterfall is assumed to be contributed and distributed pari passu, or in other words, at the same time. And all cash flow is assumed, at least by default, to be contributed and then distributed pro rata based on ownership. So that's the partnership waterfall, or the partnership level module in this model. Let me talk through the specific inputs. So the first input is GP contributions, and the percentage is actually driven up here in our sources and uses section, where we choose whether the GP or what percentage of equity is distributed or contributed by the GP versus the LP. So in this case, we're assuming, let's say 10% is contributed by the GP, 90% by the LP, based on the uses of capital, in this case, 68.544 million. And with a loan of 65%, we need just shy of 24 million of equity. Again, 2.4 million of that coming from the GP, the balance coming from the LP. So those are our contributions of capital. Now, also in the partnership level cash flow section here, we can enter the name of the GP. So we might say, let's call it ACRE Capital, and then we say Lifeco LP is the name of our LP. And out here to the right, then we see, of course, the contributions from each of the partners. Then we get into the structure of the waterfall itself. So what we're saying in this first tier, up to a 9% IRR, 10% will be split, or of the total distributions available, 10% will go to the GP, 90% will go to the LP. And you'll notice that there's a formula, default formula entered here, even though this is a blue font cell, so you can change this if you want to change the percentage that's distributed in the first tier to each of the partners, but by default, it's distributed pro rata. So in this case, the GP owns 10% of the partnership, or in other words, it's contributed 10% of the required capital or required equity. The LP then the distribution is 10% to the GP and 90% to the LP. But we could go 0%, we could go 5%, but Again, by default, it will be equal to the percentage contributor or the ownership share of the GP. So that's the first tier. The second tier then is when a promote is paid to the GP. So from a 9 to a 12 or up to a 12% IRR, the GP is paid a promote, and the partnership is the entity that is promoted, okay? Or in other words, the partnership pays the GP some promote. So in this case, the partnership pays the GP a 10% promote. The remaining 90% is owned 10% by the GP, 90% by the LP, such that in this second tier, the GP is distributed 19% of total available cash flow, 10% in a promote, 9% in the remaining cash flow, and the LP is distributed 81%. The same happens then for the third tier. Up to a 15% IRR, now the GP is paid a promote of some amount, in this case 20%. We could change this, say 5%, 10%, 20%. We could change these hurdles, 8, 10, 12. You get the idea. So here, up to some percentage, a promote of some amount is paid to the GP. And then out here to the right, it automatically calculates the distribution percentage to each of the partners based on the promote paid to the GP and the percentage that the GP owns of the remainder of the partnership versus the LP. Then in the fourth tier is really any excess cash flow. So above a 12, there's a 20% in this case promote paid to the GP, which results in 72% paid to distributed to the LP, 28% distributed to the GP in this tier. Now down below, you can then track the GP LP distributions. I also have a line that tracks the GP fees that are paid. And the reason why I track those separately is occasionally you'll have the entity that receives the fees is different than the entity that actually contributes capital on behalf of the GP. And so I've separated these three out. You can at least see the distributions for each. So in this case, the GP, its capital returns $4.5 million in distributions. There's $1.752 million in fees paid and $35.6248 million distributed to the LP. And then you see the net cash flow. So this is the combination of both the contributions and the distributions to each of the partners, an equity multiple calculated for each of the partners, and an IRR calculated for each of the partners. Now, finally, what about the GP fees and the inputs around those? So that's housed in this section. You first have the option just to turn the fees off altogether. When that happens, you see here 0% or zero is distributed in fees. If we turn it on, the fees are now included in the GP's returns, and you also have then the GP fees line here within the GP-LP distributions. And we have an option to include an acquisition fee and a disposition fee. Acquisition fee happening in time 0, disposition fee happening at analysis end. We can then have an asset management fee paid to the GP, and there's a few options for how that fee is paid. It can either be a percent of the LP equity or a percent of EGR. You see then the asset management fee per month here. In the case of a percent of EGR, this is simply the first month. And you'll see out here to the right that it actually varies depending on what EGR is in each period. And then you have the option to accrue fees. So let's say that there is insufficient cash flow to pay out fees. Should those fees accrue and be paid later, or should they not? And that can be chosen there. And so that is the partnership level cash flow, or the waterfall module in my value add apartment acquisition model. Let me know if you have any questions about this particular module. Otherwise, thanks for your time.